Hello, and welcome to week 2 of high school mythology. So, this week we're going to talk about the lesser gods of Earth. We're also going to talk a little bit about Roman gods before the influence of the Greek. And we'll talk too about the creation of the world according to Greek mythology. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slides now, and we will go from here. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the lesser gods of the earth. So you had Demeter, and Demeter was goddess of corn. And you have Dionysus, who is god of wine. So that is their Greek name. But if we were to take a look at Demeter's Roman name, it's Ceres. That's where we get the word cereal, because of course, grain. And Dionysus's Roman counterpart is Bacchus. So again, like we said, both of them have to do with the earth and have to do with growth. Demeter, of course, being goddess of corn and grain, and Dionysus being god of wine and revelry. So they are featured in several different myths. Probably the most well-known myth that features Demeter, of course, is the one in which her daughter Persephone is kidnapped, and we'll talk about that in more details in just a little while. And you'll also recall from your reading one of the stories about Dionysus that especially illustrates his nature of causing madness in people. So some of the other lesser gods of the earth would be Pan. Pan is the son of Hermes. He has goat's horns and hooves. He's known as the shepherd's god and the goat herd's god. He's also a companion of wood nymphs, and he is deep in the forest. So he lives in the wild places. He plays music on his reed pipe. And interestingly enough, Pan, that's where we get our word panic. Of course, when you feel terror and fear. And that is because for the Greeks of this time, they believed that if you went too far into the woods, if you went too far outside of civilization, that you could meet some very dangerous consequences, because they did believe that certain parts of the forest and other wild places were the domain of the gods and goddesses and not a place for mortals to tread. So that's where we get this idea of Pan, meaning panic, because if they got too far in the woods, too near the dwelling of Pan, they would start to panic, right? Then we also have Silenus. So Silenus is sometimes said to be the son of Pan, and at other times he's said to be Pan's brother. But Silenus is kind of a funny character. He's jolly and fat, and he rides a donkey. And he has to ride a donkey because he's too drunk to walk. So clearly he's also associated with Dionysus or Roman counterpart Bacchus. Then we have Castor and Pollux, who are the twins, and they are the Gemini constellation. So that is one example there of how mythology was used to try to explain natural occurrences. Then we also have the Sileni. They're part man and part horse. There aren't really any stories about them. They are only seen in Greek art. Then you have satyrs, which are, what Pan is, goat men who live in the wild places. Some of the woodland creatures that we would have would be the Oreads. Those are nymphs that dwell in the mountains, and the Dryads are nymphs that live in trees. The Dryads who live in the trees, their life is tied to the life of the tree, so that if you were to cut the tree down, you would end the life not only of the tree, but also of the dryad who lived inside. Then we have Aeolus, who is king of the winds, and there are 4 chief winds. Boreas is the north wind, and the Roman name for it is Aquilo. The west wind in Greek mythology is Zephyr, and in Roman mythology is Favonius. The south wind is Notus in Greek mythology, and Auster in Roman mythology. And the east wind is Eurus in Greek, and then it's also Eurus in Roman mythology. Additionally, some of the other lesser gods are centaurs. Those are half men and half horse. The most famous of them is Chiron. Now, typically the centaurs were brutish and lawless, and Chiron, of course, is an exception to that rule. He trains a lot of the heroes. You also have the Gorgons. There are 3 of them. 2 are immortal and 1 is mortal, and that is Medusa. And we'll get further into the details of Medusa's story at a later point in this class. But right now we're just kind of taking a look at the lesser gods of the earth, and the Gorgons are part of those. So, of course, the Gorgons have these dragon-like features. They have wings. They turn men into stone, right? If they look into your eyes. Medusa, her name means queen or ruler. The other 2 Gorgons are named Stheno and Euryale. Stheno means strength, and Euryale means wide leaping. Then you also had the Gray, or the Gray sisters. There are 3 gray women who all share one eye. And later on in class, we will read the story of Perseus, and we will see more, of course, of Medusa when we get to that story, and we will also see more of the Gray. So that gets us kind of built up here to the different characters that we have. We also have sirens. Sirens live on an island in the sea. They had very mesmerizing, beautiful voices, and they would use those voices to lure sailors to their deaths. And they will come prominently back into our studies whenever we read about Odysseus. So as you can tell, last week and this week is really that background time where we're getting an idea of the different gods and goddesses and other characters in mythology. So that way, when we start to get into the stories, we already know the characteristics of the different gods and goddesses, and we know some background about the men and women who make up these stories. So the fates are mentioned in this section too. So the fates are called the Morai in Greek and the Parse in Latin. And so according to the writer Hesiod, the fates give people both good and evil when they're born. So there's a couple of different ways that they're looked at. Some designate them there at the beginning and at the end of life, doling out both good and evil. And then others associate them more towards the end of life. So the fates had the ultimate control over someone's timeline of life. Zeus could not override the fates when it came to determining someone's time of death. So with the 3 fates, they have names also. Clotho is the spinner. So she is spinning that thread of life. Lachesis is the one who is the disposer of lots. So she's going to be determining, when that, lot is handed out, whether someone gets good or bad, if someone lives or dies. And then you had the third fate, Atropos. She carries the shears or the scissors, right? That snip that line. Now, of course, in the Disney animated version of Hercules, you'll notice, especially if you don't already know, when we get on into this class and we actually study Hercules, or Heracles is actually his Greek name, you'll see that the Disney, not surprisingly, version changed up a lot of things about the original story. However, I really do like the depiction of the three fates in that animated version, because it very clearly shows one spinning the thread, one holding it up, and the other one cutting the thread to indicate someone's death. So the fates will be important in several of the myths, as will fate in general in these stories. So let's talk a little bit more about Roman gods before we get into some of the specifics of Demeter and Dionysus. So, of course, you can see here that you have Roman mythology, so to speak, cheating off of Greek mythology, right? Because a lot of the gods and goddesses from Greek mythology, the Romans just took them over and changed their names. Although a couple of instances, they kept the names the same too. But to be completely fair to the Romans, they did have a few specific gods of their own. However, they were vague. They didn't have these distinct personalities like the gods and goddesses that we see in Greek mythology. They were more or less powers. So the Greeks, of course, gave distinct characteristics and told stories about their gods and goddesses. But for the Romans, their gods were just pretty much no more, according to Edith Hamilton mythology, right? Those that are above. So the names that the Romans had for their gods, you had the Numina, and the Numina means powers or the wheels, maybe even willpower, right? Kind of connected to fate too. They also had the specific household gods than Rome, where they would designate a lot of times an ancestor of theirs as being over the household. So they didn't have this big collective pantheon, whereas the Greeks did. They had more or less these individual household gods. However, once Rome conquered Greece, we then see this meshing together of the two belief systems. So Demeter, as we mentioned, is also known as Ceres in Roman mythology. She's the goddess of corn. She is a friend of mankind, and she knew both pain and joy. And that's one of the things that we're going to focus on here when we look at Demeter and Dionysus, how they did form a closer relationship to people, because they did, in a sense, that the other gods and goddesses did not experience pain in a way that made them more connected to human nature. So Demeter's daughter, Persephone, is out one day looking at the flowers, collecting them, picking them, and Hades, down in the underworld, he sees Persephone and he wants Persephone for himself. And so he takes her against her will, kidnaps her, and takes her down into the underworld. Well, Demeter goes in search of Persephone and she cannot find her. So she is asking around to see if anyone knows what happened to Persephone. And she comes across Hecate, who is the Greek goddess of magic and witchcraft. And Hecate tells Demeter, well, I know something happened. I don't know exactly what it was, but ask Helios. And Helios is the personification of the sun. So Hecate says, ask Helios because he sees everything. So Demeter goes and finds out from Helios that Persephone has been kidnapped by Hades. Now, we've talked about, of course, how Demeter is the goddess of corn and grain. She's the goddess of fertility. She's responsible for making sure that the plants and the flowers and the trees grow, and that the earth is fertile. But because she is in such grief over the loss of Persephone, she does not nourish the earth. So everything starts to die. And the gods and goddesses get upset about that. Not because they're really worried about people, because you'll see as we get in these stories, that's not really in their nature. But instead, they're upset because the people cannot sacrifice to them anymore because they don't have any crops and their animals are dying. So they go to Zeus and they demand that he do something about Demeter and make her start, taking care of the earth and making things grow again. And Demeter refuses to do so unless Zeus gives Persephone back to her. And so Zeus does that. However, Hades, before Persephone goes, he says, hey, don't you want something to eat? And if you eat food in the underworld, then you are bound to the underworld. So, according to some of the different versions, some of the ancient writers write that Persephone had 4 pomegranate seeds. Some say that she had 6. Some say that she had 3. But at any rate, she does partake of some food, some pomegranate seeds, while she's in the underworld. And she is bound at least part of the year to the underworld. So, of course, the 6 seeds would mean half the year, right? 6 months. 4 would mean 4 months, 3 months, so on. But the major point is not to get too worried about how many seeds she took, but to understand that the part of the year where Demeter is separate from Persephone, that is the time where we have fall and winter. When Persephone's in the underworld, Demeter is too grieved to make the earth fertile. So again, we see a myth being used to explain natural, cycles of seasons. And that, of course, because she is separate from her daughter for part of the year, that allows Demeter to know both pain and joy. Of course, the pain of separation, but then the joy whenever Persephone returns to her that part of the year. Then we have Dionysus, a Roman name Bacchus, the god of wine and revelry. So as you already have learned about Zeus, Zeus is a philanderer. He is not faithful to his wife Hera. And this happens once again in the story of Dionysus. Zeus is having a romantic relationship with Semele, and Zeus decides to tell Semele that she can have anything that she wants, and he swears on the river Styx that he will give her whatever she asks for. Now, if a god or goddess makes a promise or an oath or swears on the river Styx, they are bound to that oath no matter what. And so Hera has caught wind already that Zeus is having this fling with Semele, And so Zeus has been hiding himself the whole time, because if Semele or any mortal was to look on Zeus completely in his most heavenly deified form, then it would kill them. And so Zeus has been hiding, and not showing his actual form to her. But Hera convinces Semele, of course, Hera is wanting to get rid of Semele, right? So she convinces her to ask Zeus to show himself, if indeed it really is Zeus. So she casts that doubt, right, for Semele, who's been with this person claiming to be Zeus, but she makes her doubt it. So she initially goes on in, and she gets ready to ask Zeus for whatever she wants. He's already sworn on the river Styx, so he can't backtrack. And whenever he reveals his true form to her, of course, she dies. However, she is already expecting their child. And in true Greek mythology form, whenever Semele starts to die, Zeus takes Dionysus out and puts Dionysus in his hip, and then Dionysus continues to grow, and later on, Zeus gives birth, I guess you could say, to Dionysus. So that is Dionysus's origin story. And because Dionysus is representative of a kind of dualistic nature of wine, he can be a friend to mankind, but he can also be a, cause men to do terrible things. And that kind of lines up with, with wine, that it can be a joyful thing, but it can also become a problem in certain circumstances. So we get a very brutal story about Dionysus, in that he shows up, and this king doesn't recognize him as a god, doesn't give him proper respect. And so Dionysus causes all the women in that village to go into this frenzy, including this king's mother. And the king goes out to capture Dionysus again, and his mother, along with the other women, rip him up to shreds because they are so consumed with Dionysus and with wine that they have just gone like animal like on this king, and he's torn from pieces, shredded, right? So that shows us that very brutal side of Dionysus. But Dionysus himself also knows pain, because he is the god of wine. So that, of course, is connected to the vine. And every year he has to be pruned, just like the plants. The vines, right, would have to be pruned so that they can grow back and be healthier the next year. So he experiences that pain too, and being pruned each year and then resurrected. So he has a resurrection story, because he is pruned or killed, every year, and then he rises again. So that is very similar, of course, then to what happens with Persephone, as she is in the underworld part of the year, and then the other time she's resurrected back into the land of the living. So these characters do have, again, like we said, a little bit more connection to humans, because they do experience pain in their lives. So the creation of the world and mankind. So it's interesting because you have chaos and love, and they kind of come together and shape what becomes the earth. We get mankind we won't go into all of the titans and all of that here, because of course that's in your book. So make sure that you do read, about the titans. But one of the things that I really want us to focus on here that's going to lead us into a lot of the myths that will feature in this class is this idea of good and evil, and despair and hope. How even in the darkest times, of course, love is born out of that darkness. We also see this conflict with good and evil. We see one of the titans that we really want to talk about is Prometheus, because Prometheus angers Zeus because Prometheus gives men the gift of fire. And Prometheus also teaches men how to keep the best part of meat for themselves and sacrifice the not so best part to the gods. And so Prometheus, for those reasons, angers Zeus. And so Zeus punishes Prometheus by chaining him in the Caucasus Mountains. And the Caucasus eagle comes every day and eats Prometheus's liver. Then his liver grows back so that the eagle can come the next day and do it all over again. So Prometheus is punished until, as we'll find out later on, he does get set free eventually. So we also have the story of Pandora, where we get some very negative views of women, right? According to Greek writing at this time, where women are blamed for all kinds of evil. And we see that case with Pandora, who is told that she must not open a jar. Now, sometimes the myths will say box, but typically it would have been more, likely to have been like a jar. But whether it's a jar or box, she doesn't, pay attention to the advice not to open it, and she opens it anyway. And when she does, it releases all of the terrible, despairing things into the world. However, it also releases hope. So that's that reminder that even in the, most dark times, there's this element of hope. So with those kind of things in mind, we will wrap this up now. Be sure to check on our classroom page for your poem and the discussion to go with it this week. And if you have any questions, please message me or let me know by replying to the classroom post. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.